Thom Kiddle, he's the director of NILE, is an ELT expert who's worked in Chile as a university director, academic research director, and is working from Norwich today, and is going to be talking about principles and practices in asynchronous online learning. So Thom, if you can hear me, can you please turn your camera and mic on again? We all know that you're very busy, so we really appreciate the fact, step by step, yeah, you're really busy, so we really appreciate the fact that you're making the time to be with us. It's really great to see so many of you. So Thom is turning his camera and mic on. As I said before, our servers and our Click Meeting servers are overloaded because a lot of people are, hi Thom, working from home. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Federica?
Yes, I can hear you okay, I can see you, so I'm gonna hand over and thank you again for being here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. Good morning from Norwich. Welcome to my home. You can see that it's rather bright behind me. This is my youngest son's bedroom, the quietest place in the house while they're learning from home downstairs. It's great to be here, and I really in awe of the way that everybody is pulling together and offering all of this content to help each other in our learning communities around the world. I shouldn't be looking at the public chat box. It's quite overwhelming to see how many different countries are represented in this webinar, and I hope I can do it justice in terms of sharing my experience and the experience of NILE of what asynchronous online learning means. And we're going to work through some aspects of live versus asynchronous teaching online, and then focus in on what we mean really when we're talking about asynchronous online teaching, looking at the platforms that are available, talking about the platforms that are available, the typical kinds of activity that are available in asynchronous virtual learning environments, and then talking about what it means in terms of teacher competences, in terms of setting up courses, and where the teaching exists. Because I think that what we're often facing is trying to put the teaching into the asynchronous space. When we look at the differences between live and asynchronous teaching, it's very easy to see the links between the face-to-face classroom environment and a live online environment. In a live online environment, very similar to a face-to-face classroom, all the students are in there at the same time. We have scheduled sessions, we have a timetable of when the class starts and when the class finishes, and when the teacher walks in the door or turns on the webcam and appears in the classroom. We have in our online space what's often called a host and participants, the terminology rather than a teacher and students, because these are used in multiple settings, not just educational settings. The platforms that we're using for live teaching can be applied to all sorts of interactions. And we have a range of different platforms that give us that virtual space. You'll be familiar with new names that have entered our lexicon in the last few months, the Zoom platforms, the Click Meeting we're on today, the Adobe Connect platforms, the Blackboard Collaborate, the Google Meet. All of these different online spaces give us that sense of bringing people together and working at the same time in a live online space, sometimes called synchronous teaching. I prefer to use the term live because I think it's easy to miss the prefix of a in asynchronous and to be confused about if we're talking about synchronous versus asynchronous. It's probably one of the most useless little prefixes in English, that little a for asynchronous. We say, well, what is it that asynchronous really focuses on in terms of teaching and learning is our focus today. And so the differences that we want to draw from asynchronous against live are that in asynchronous teaching, largely the content is accessed and the activities are accessed and completed and participated in at a time of students' own choosing. We can have that in lockstep, and we can say, okay, we want this all to be done today, or we want this all to be done in the next 2 hours, or we want this to be done during this week. But largely, the decisions about when to access the asynchronous content and the asynchronous activities are at this time of the student's choosing, at the time, hopefully, of students' convenience. But we still have the possibility to do collaborative activities, collaborative between students as peers and between teacher and students in a traditional educational relationship. And we have the capacity for students to do individual activities. I think there's a sense of an old style of asynchronous teaching that it essentially means interaction between preloaded content and individual access. But we want to emphasize the fact today that there's a lot more collaborative activities that are possible within the virtual learning environments, within the platforms that are available for asynchronous teaching and learning today, that should be taken advantage of. And I want to try and draw the parallels between what we might do as a teacher in the face-to-face classroom and what we can do asynchronously online, because it's very challenging sometimes to see, well, where's the teaching? I can see where the teaching happens if I'm teaching live in a classroom, but I can't see where the teaching happens when I'm working asynchronously. I can see that there's content there and I can see the students access the content, but apart from providing the content, where does my role exist as a teacher? Where do I get my teaching moments? Am I able to bring my expertise to the students rather than just presenting them with content and allowing them to access it? So we're going to talk a bit about the importance of personalized and group and individual feedback as a tutor competence in asynchronous spaces, and also what we can do with feedback that's generated in an automated space, because the answers are pre-programmed, but the teacher can access the results of a group of students or a class or individuals within that. Some examples of asynchronous platforms that we're going to be referring to today. You may be familiar with some of these. Moodle platform is the one we use at now. It's the kind of the place that hosts our course. Blackboard is another very common university virtual learning environment. The one that we showcase and train on in our new free Take Your Teaching Online course is Edmodo, as it's a free virtual learning environment that anybody can set up to run classes and run courses from. And I'll be talking about a couple more as we go through. But we can see the different platforms there compared to the live platforms, in the sense of where are we going to host the content and the activities and the asynchronous work that we need to. So let's move into our first aspect of asynchronous online teaching, which really asks the question, within these platforms, what are the typical activities that are available to me? Now, I saw an article yesterday, a LinkedIn article, and it was talked about the differences between live and asynchronous teaching, saying live teaching was all about the interaction and students being able to communicate with each other, whereas asynchronous teaching was about reading PDFs and contributing to discussion forums and doing tasks by email. And it just seemed such a disappointing summary of the potential of asynchronous online teaching, that we'd be constrained to kind of essentially setting a homework task that is read this and write about it. And there's so much more that we can have in our asynchronous online environment that I think we need to kind of embrace that as part of our asynchronous online potential, rather than just saying, well, it's about uploading a document and asking students to discuss that document. So obviously, some of the things that we can do in terms of asynchronous learning are providing content for learners to work with. That content could be text-based, it could be something that we've written, it could be something that we've brought in there, it could be something that we've copied and pasted from another source, it could be referring students outside the platform to look at a course book that they've already got in front of them, that they've got physically outside the computer space. It could be something that we've generated in terms of a handout we might have used in class, and or something that we've pulled together from authentic material that we've found elsewhere on the internet. But it doesn't just have to be text-based. It could be video-based, and those videos could be something, again, that the teacher has generated. We'll talk a little bit about screencasting in a moment as asynchronous content preparation, but it could be video that's sourced from any one of the video streaming platforms, or any one of those platforms which curate interesting content from video for teaching. You may be familiar with Jamie Keddy's work in kind of lesson stream and bringing video content alive, particularly with a language learning focus. So it may be content that's brought in on video from somewhere else that's designed for language teaching, or content that's designed for general viewing, but that can be purposed for a task that we have. Similarly, we can bring in audio content. There's no reason why we couldn't do simple voice recordings using our own microphones, or we can bring in MP3 files that we've found either freely available on the internet or that belong to course resources that we have in our course materials. So rather than thinking that the only way we can do listening activities is through the live sessions, it's also possible, of course, to bring in the audio content as part of the content that we expect learners to engage with in an asynchronous space, and potentially much more valuable, because one of the things I'm going to keep coming back to is that the value of asynchronous online learning does lie in the self-paced element, the fact that you can return to content, you can access content at the time of your choosing, and as many times as you choose, to give yourself that time, that thinking time, that processing time that's very often missing in either a live online session or a face-to-face session. So emphasizing the deeper thinking, the deeper processing time, the access to doing things at your own pace, engaging with content at the time that's right for you and for the length of time that's right for you, is one of the real advantages of asynchronous online learning. So one of the aspects, of course, is about the content, and we'll talk more about the types of content in a moment. But of course, it's not just the content, it's what we do with the content. It's the activities that sit around that content. And I've broken this down to some of the typical activity types that we might find in a virtual learning environment. One side is based around focused, task-driven student activities and student responses, moving from quizzes at one end, which generally have a pre-prepared, pre-programmed automated feedback answer, so they're based around multiple choice questions or short answer questions, where we can program the virtual learning environment to tell the students the right answer afterwards. Or the kind of activities that you might find available on a content-rich platform like Macmillan English Campus, where you have these activities which generate a correct answer, generate a score in a grade book, generate the automated results in more of a selected response or a short answer response format. So we've got that kind of one end of the spectrum of student task-focused interaction. In the middle, I think we've got these things which are more questionnaire-based. If you use Moodle, you'll know there's a questionnaire function. That kind of generates qualitative content, but on a single sentence, single phrase level very often, that we get students to respond with opinions or giving examples of their language, rather than writing constructed responses, longer texts, and rather than selecting the right answer, questionnaires encourage that kind of personalization of content and short form responses that can be compiled and collated and curated and fed back on by a teacher, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got this thing that I've called assignments, which is perhaps too testing related a word. It doesn't have to be graded assignments with marking criteria, but assignments essentially mean what can we get the students to produce in terms of their own created content, rather than responding to answers that we've given them. How can they create their own contents? So that may be verbal content, it may be oral based assignments, recording their response, video-based, recording over presentations, or text-based, responding to a task that's a writing task. And all of these will require some kind of feedback to give it value, and that feedback could well come from the teacher, but it could be peer feedback as well, as we'll come on to in a moment. So we've got these kind of task-focused activities that we can set the students a task and say, I want you to respond in this way. One end of the spectrum, the quiz, where they're going to get an instant answer, to the other end of the spectrum, the assignments, where the responsibility for feedback sits elsewhere. And then we've got those kind of threaded discussions. You'll be very familiar with this from all sorts of different platforms, but a very common feature of asynchronous online learning is the kind of forum-based approach, a starting post, an initial post, and then responses to that post from peers, from colleagues, and from the teacher, the expert in that space as well. Forums tend to make us think of written responses, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be just text followed by text. A lot of platforms will offer opportunities to have threaded voice discussions. And some of the tools that we use at Nile very much focused on this multimodality of response in a discussion. So you can either choose to respond with text, or you can choose to respond with your microphone, or you can choose to respond with your webcam, giving that kind of sense of choice for students. So forums can, yes, they can be text-based, but they can also be multimodal in nature. There's a lovely tool. One of the tools that we feature in our new free online course is called Flipgrid, and Flipgrid is based around staggered discussions, responses through short uploaded video content from students. So the teacher starts a discussion, often starts the discussion with their own video, and then students respond, continue that discussion, continue the theme with their own video-based responses. So this tool gives us the option for the same kind of staggered discussion as the forum. We need to move away from thinking of forums as just text-based interactions. Obviously, the asynchronous nature of this means that those discussions take place over time, and there's a teaching competence attached to that. So how can the teacher hold engagement? How can the teacher direct the flow of the discussion? How can the teacher make sure that there's rich content and support going in there? And that's another teacher competence that we'll come on to talk about in a moment. Another form of collaboration is that kind of co-constructed space, tools which encourage students, participants to work together to create a piece of content. That may be content that's idea-based. It may be just a kind of a space to share ideas and collate ideas and to rearrange, organize ideas, or it may be quite a good deal more rich. It may be a collaborative writing activity, a wiki-based activity where multiple people are contributing to the same document, whether that's creating a narrative or creating a brochure or creating some other project-based activity. That idea of having asynchronous collaboration, the project-focused development between the students with the teacher commenting, supporting and feeding back, is also something that works very well asynchronously, because it allows that external resource use. It allows that pacing that couldn't happen effectively within the confines of a live or face-to-face lesson, and it allows that shared space where we can see attributions of who's contributed what to the final product or to the outcome. And it's also very easy to share online within the environment for other people to comment and give peer feedback and praise and support and all of those kind of peer assessment principles that we'd want to hold dear. So there's the wiki side where we're creating a project, but there are also those kind of just throw out ideas, the walls, the whiteboards. You're probably very familiar with a tool which is shown in the image here, Padlet, where people can contribute all bits of different content, media-rich content, image-based content, text-based content, video-based content, annotation content, creating a collaborative space. And that can be driven by a task from the teacher, or it can be just opened up for students to personalize a particular topic in a way they're interested in. That can be centrally created, or it can be something that's individually created and then shared as individual spaces for comparison and feedback at a later stage. And then we have a whole load of tools that we might just refer to as web whiteboards. In fact, web whiteboard is one of the easiest to use. If you want a space where anybody who has the link can contribute something in very short form, can write, can annotate, can draw, can comment through emojis in a shared collaborative space. Very easy to find access to a web whiteboard that can be that space that can be contributed to over time and build up a rich content space that we can feed back on. Other content that can be used is having downloads in there. So when we want students to be studying something for offline perhaps, or to read in more depth, or to listen to in more depth, we can add content that can be downloaded. And also, of course, the virtual learning environment can be a space where we offer links to other third-party activities, or to third-party content, or to applications, to resources, to dictionary resources, to corpus resources, to particular tools that the students will bring in to this space. And again, this is one of the advantages of content in the asynchronous space, that we have that time for students to go off and come back to the shared central space in order to bring this together. I talk in some of my webinars about live online teaching, how dangerous it is to send students outside the classroom space while you're running the session, because it's difficult to get them back in there. But I don't think that rule applies for asynchronous teaching. It's one of the great advantages to be able to send students off to other resources, think about them, process them, use those resources, and bring that knowledge, bring that learning back into the shared asynchronous space. So I'm trying to make the point that we've got a lot of variety. We've got a lot of variety in terms of content and activity types, rather than just thinking asynchronous online learning means putting up some content and setting up a discussion or giving a think about task. And I want to move on to think about, well, where does that content come from? I think it's useful to think about what are we talking about in terms of content. So we get that sense of variety, that sense that content in an asynchronous space doesn't have to be single channel, doesn't have to be just a content that comes from a single source. That the richness in an asynchronous space, just as the richness in a face-to-face classroom, comes from bringing content and personalizing the content, and also having pre-prepared content which is professionally produced. So I like to think of content in three areas. Content which is generated by the teacher. So this is content which you've decided is appropriate for your own context, for the level of your students, for the interests of your students. And one of the most rich tools for screencasting is for generating teachers' content is screencasting. Now, my colleague Russell Stannard does a lot of work on screencasting. You'll be able to see his videos on how to use free screencasting tools on his channel of teacher training videos. But essentially, screencasting is a way of putting your content into a video that you can then embed into a virtual learning environment. And that may just be welcome videos. That may just be something that introduces students to the task. And in terms of generating the content for a lesson, it may be that you're doing a mini presentation, or you're talking about the particular topic area to give students an insight into that content, making your own screencast there. We've already talked about the richness of teachers being able to generate and bring in video content that's appropriate, bring in their own text, whether that's authentic text or graded text from course-specific materials, and bringing in audio files as well, audio files that they've made, audio files that have come with a course book or particular resource. And also teacher-generated content in terms of when in a face-to-face classroom we might be preparing a handout. It's similarly really rich content for teachers to generate that as documents, handouts that can be downloaded, worked on, resubmitted. It doesn't have to be that every activity takes place within the virtual learning environment. So there's content that's brought in by the teacher, but crucially, I think in the asynchronous space, even more so than in the live space, there's student-generated content. There's content which can be brought in by the students' contributions in terms of responses to activities that we've set, in terms of using their presentations, their assignments as rich content to be learning content for others, to be used as the springboard for further exploration, for extension of the language focus or the topic focus, and for students to bring in their own attachments, to bring in their own their own personalized part of the learning. That may be their favorite songs. It may be something that they've produced, a kind of a book review that they've produced. It may be images that they have taken from their local environment that add this richness to the course. So using the students as generating the content, just as we do in a personalized approach to communicative language teaching. I think student generated content is really a rich resource asynchronously. It's quite hard to do that live because we don't have the preparation time, and students can potentially be quite silent in terms of exposing themselves with their language proficiency in a live space. But the advantage of the asynchronous world is that they have time to check, they have time to proof their own language, they have time to be comfortable with what they upload and what they share before they do it. And then, of course, we have that whole richness of the third-party generated content. We've got platforms which are full of content in terms of presentations and practice activities and texts, like Macmillan English Campus, where we get this professionally produced, graded language content. You've probably, if you have moved very recently into teaching online, you've probably still got students with physical course books that give us this content, that give us this possibility of sending students outside the virtual learning environment to do readings in a physical course book. And then you've got all of that richness that's the internet, in terms of where they can access information about language, where they can access language examples, where they can access video content on language, and where you can send them with links to other practice activities that are freely available online. So we've got a huge range of different content types, and I think that some of the benefits of asynchronous teaching are that we can bring in this variety, that a particular course doesn't have to focus on it's the teacher doing a presentation and the students responding to it, or it's about doing these set of formulated exercises and then the teacher giving the marks. That the richness in the teaching can come from the variety in the content that we bring in. I'm seeing some comments there to slow down. Absolutely fine. I'm going to slow my speech down for you here. I'm trying to emphasize that the variety available to the teacher, to the person programming a course, is to upload a range of different types of content and to use different sources for that content in order to create the richness of the online space, and that we shouldn't think of formulaic approaches to content, that every unit, every activity is the same, but that we should try to encourage that there's peer student generated content to support things that the teachers can produce and can bring in from elsewhere. I want to move on to talk about teacher competences, because I think one of the key things about asynchronous online teaching is, what do I need to do in terms of managing the interaction of the participants in my course? Now, of course, we have our classroom management skills in terms of face-to-face classrooms, and we're developing those skills sometimes with a huge challenge in live online spaces. But managing interaction in an asynchronous space is much more complex, because we don't have that immediacy of corrective feedback, corrective management to bring people back to the same space. Excuse me. So some of the things I want to emphasize that become part of teachers' competencies in asynchronous teaching are thinking about how you're creating that rapport. Now, we know that rapport within a face-to-face space is very important in terms of creating learners' identities and allowing them to feel some presence in the classroom and some ownership of the classroom space. But socialization in online asynchronous teaching is also very important. So if your class has suddenly moved online from being a face-to-face class, you may be less concerned with the kind of getting to know you activities and building class cohesion. But if you're starting a course online, it's really important to have that space to have socialization activities that are about introducing yourself, to establish your online identity, to establish how much of your online identity you're prepared to share. So in some contexts, that may be very open and it may be webcam based and presenting yourself. In other contexts, it may be that you choose an image as your avatar, not even a picture of yourself. And you want to kind of preserve some of your individual identity rather than sharing it, sharing your picture, sharing any personal information online. Of course, we have to consider the sharing of personal data and allowing the online space to be a safe space for everybody. But socialization within that is still possible, and that may be a kind of more traditional introduce yourself via this forum, but it could also be a peer discussion activity where you interact asynchronously with a fellow student in the class and then introduce them in some way. It may be that you're talking about something that's you find differences and similarities between yourself and other students in the class through a discussion activity or a collaborative space like a whiteboard or a wall. But encouraging that socialization so that we feel we're talking to and working with real people on the other side of computer screens is crucial in managing and setting up that interaction. The second point is the crucial difference between what we do with content in face-to-face and live teaching and what we do with content in asynchronous teaching. It's very tempting, and I see a lot of examples of the idea that uploading content is the task in itself. It's not the case. We need to be clear that whenever we add some content, whether that's text, whether that's audio, whether that's video, that the task is central to how the students will interact with that content. It's not appropriate for online learning just to put things up and say, read this or watch this video. There's got to be a clear task. There's got to be a way of interacting with that actually makes the task the focus of the activity and makes the parameters of the task ones the students know what they're doing. So what do you want them to do in terms of how they're thinking about how they're processing the content? Are they reading it for personal affective engagement? Are they reading it to pull out bits of language that they're interested in? Are they reading it with a comprehension task that goes with it? Are they reading it with a productive task that comes on the end of it? How long do you want them to spend on that task, and where do you want them to respond to that? And do you want that response to be for the teacher's eyes? Do you want that response to be for their own vocabulary development? Do you want that to be for peer sharing? So you need to be quite specific in terms of the task that accompanies the content, because that's the hook that you haven't got the opportunity to go back in as you would in a classroom and monitor and check that they're on task. We need to give them these parameters, these kind of guidelines in terms of content belongs with tasks, even if those tasks are, I want you to think about this and pull out 3 bits of language that are useful to you, or take away 2 phrases, 2 words that you didn't know before and share them in this space. I really feel that in terms of engaging with content, that you have to have some response built into the content in an asynchronous space. I completely agree. One comment there that it's the same in face-to-face teaching, but in face-to-face teaching, you often have the opportunity to see where that's breaking down and where you might need to input or to reiterate the task or to reinforce the task. In asynchronous spaces, once you've lost that engagement with the content, it's very hard to get it back. I think in terms of interaction, we need to increase variety. We need to think that although it's tempting to set up a structure where every unit follows the same stage, we have a piece of content to watch or listen to, we have a comprehension task, we have a discussion forum, and that's our model, and that's how we'll progress through every topic unit or every structural point in the language syllabus. It does get very repetitive in an asynchronous online space. in a face-to-face classroom or a live classroom, the teacher can add the dynamism to that, can add the creativity to that stops it being repetitive. But when it's presented in an online asynchronous environment, I think that working through and knowing exactly what's going to come next can add to the kind of, this is a task that I'm forced to do rather than something I'm engaging with. So increasing the variety and the different tasks you offer the students, but also the order in which you do them and the types of responses you expect are really important in asynchronous teaching. I also think it's crucial to make sure that your tasks have depth, that the depth comes from taking advantage of the increased processing time, the increased thinking time that the asynchronous space allows. So getting students to go off and rather than putting in an instantaneous response, seeing a task and giving a response, that actually they are using other resources, they're using their online dictionary, they're using a corpus tool, they're researching the language, they're proofreading their own responses, and they're extending their responses beyond what we maybe have time for in a face-to-face classroom. And that depth is where we can really see the value of the asynchronous space. I think it's important to encourage, where possible, those constructed responses, to take advantage of that idea that students have time to write and time to plan and time to edit and time to proofread. So we encourage them to generate their own language that's the source of feedback or collaboration or interaction with peers, rather than selecting responses and feeling that asynchronous interaction means here's the content, here's the multiple choice questions, job done. I think another point to make there in terms of that content, I think it's nice to send people to external links if you've checked those external links and you're sure that access is easy and that the content can be retrieved in a way that they want, or you open that to learner autonomy. But I think it can get very diverse if we send them off to other platforms which also require logins and sign-ups and generating accounts, and may head them off into worlds where the content may be inappropriate for them to use or to be exposed to. So I think be very careful if you're directing them to use certain resources. Check out those resources carefully and make sure they do the job that you're asking them to do, or ask learners to use their own resources and feedback on ones which worked effectively for them. And finally, instead of constructed responses is when students generate a piece of text from themselves rather than select a response in a multiple choice space or write a single sentence in response to a closed question. Constructed response means generating the language content yourself. And of course, that final thing about copyright restrictions in terms of what you can embed in your own online platform. Not everything is copyright free, and in some contexts, scanning a course book and putting it up there would not be copyright acceptable. So do think about what you can put this. Okay, I'm going to go with one more set of ideas, things that I think are crucial here, and then talk a little bit more about some other resources. I think another teacher competence that we really have to encourage is the idea of what feedback we can manage in an online asynchronous space. Where does the teaching come in? And really, this is where, for me, the skill as a teacher is still upheld in an asynchronous space, that the feedback that the teacher can give to either the individual or to the group is really where the teaching comes in. Now, I'm not going to claim or be flippant about the idea that this suddenly reduces the teacher's workload. Potentially, having constructed responses and promising individual formative feedback on each response is a huge imposition on teachers' time, particularly when putting new content up, preparing new activities, thinking about the next set of tasks is a day-to-day process. So manage your own time in terms of the tasks you set. Is it that you're going to give individual feedback, or are you going to pull out some of the key points from everybody's responses and give a summary of those, and manage the students' expectations in terms of what they can get. Yes, they've written 150 words as a post, but are you going to be able to respond to 20 times 150 words in the way you'd want to? On occasion, yes, absolutely, but maybe you want to do group feedback or encourage peer feedback in that space to add the variety and to avoid overloading yourself with marking responses and responding online. Do look for those opportunities when you've got people doing similar or the same task. Look for those opportunities to pull out what are the common threads, the common themes, the common needs in terms of students, and don't feel guilty about giving group feedback that's supportive and formative to all in an asynchronous space, particularly as that then becomes a referable reference resource for others to go back and look at again. Don't feel that every individual has to get a personalized response if we're doing constructed response activities. And consider whether peer response, whether reading each other's answers, building on each other's positive feedback is an acceptable way to manage that, to reduce the load on yourself. Can we get that first phase feedback, that positive encouragement, that I really liked this that you did, coming from peers rather than it all being dependent on the teacher to give feedback? When the teacher is taking on the role of giving feedback and giving supportive feedback, then it's crucial to value the students' contributions within the group, making sure that students are recognized when they can see each other's answers, and when the teacher's feeding back to a whole group, that students are named and get that attention for the quality that they've produced in there. What we refer to at NILE is the concept of weaving and waving. So weaving means trying through a discussion, through a collaborative space, to weave students' contributions together, to say, this sounds very similar to a point that this person was making, or there's a lot of similarities between this answer and this answer. Or waving, and waving means highlighting great uses of language, great examples of something that's been produced by students. So saying, I really liked what so-and-so did in this activity, or there's a great point made in so-and-so's post on this content, or the response to this questionnaire was really interesting from this person. So valuing those individual students, making them sure that their content is being noticed and seen by the teacher and highlighted by the teacher to others is critical. And related to that is this idea of how teachers manage the feedback from start to finish of an activity done asynchronously. The idea of seeding, feeding, and harvesting. The seeding is the planting the seed, the setting of the content, the engaging them with the task, the setting of the controversial statement, or the image that's going to get them fired up. And then as the conversation begins, as the asynchronous contributions come in, feeding in more ideas, feeding in potential resource links, feeding in language contributions to support that output, feeding in perhaps corrective feedback during the discussion. And then at the end of the activity, whether that's the end of the week or the end of the day or the end of a particular unit, the teacher having the skills to harvest the good points, harvest the things that we want to be positive about, to bring those things together and really highlight the strengths that the students have produced, giving that praise, but without necessarily feeling that we have to do individual contributions in terms of feedback. So those two sets of teacher competencies in the asynchronous space, I think, are crucial. Being able to weave contributions together to make it a cohesive whole and wave at positive ideas, and also to set up a task, feed in the other resources and the teaching moments that are appropriate, and harvest things at the end to round it off. Crucial. Part of the feeding is giving further development, giving further resources, giving extension activities, making that formative but also with spaces, and encouraging that can be highlighted at the end, and also kind of seen as a springboard for students to go off and research something further or to have further practice somewhere else. And finally, in terms of that feedback, I think it's really crucial, just as we would in a face-to-face context, to think about that constructive comments and positive feedback, the encouragement that you get in an online space is really valuable. We've worked with this for 5 years in asynchronous online teaching at Nile, and really that positive encouragement to encourage people to feel confidence in sharing their ideas that are far more permanent than if they were in a face-to-face classroom, that stay there, that can be revisited, that are open and accessible to other students in the class to pick through their language in a far greater depth than the ephemerality of the face-to-face or the live environment. We really need to support that and encourage people, particularly in the first weeks, the first moments of a course, that their contributions are valued and their contributions are rich, and their contributions are what are contributing to the course. So these are the crucial things, I think, in terms of deciding what content to add, in terms of managing interaction in an asynchronous space, and in terms of being in control and managing expectations and the skills that are involved in giving effective feedback. There's lots more that we can offer. I mentioned earlier a free online course. We've been working really hard over the last 3 weeks to put together this online course, which covers aspects of platform development, content generation, activity creation, teaching live lessons, further resources, and all written by Nile experts in collaboration with Russell Stannard teacher training videos. You can get that from the Nile website now and enroll for free. There's also a membership area that you can sign up for on the Nile website. Loads of different teaching activities in that space, which can be easily adapted to both live and asynchronous online teaching. Great ideas for how you can get students collaborating. And then Nile online courses, which take your teaching competences to new levels, are also available through our website. So I hope that's a useful resource for you to work with and work on in the coming weeks and coming months. A couple of links there to our website and to me personally, if you want to ask any questions related to the content I've talked about here. I'm very grateful to Macmillan for the opportunity to speak to you. I know that this has been a challenging set of circumstances that continues, and it's going to get better for us all soon, but more challenging for some of us in the immediate future. And I hope that the support that Macmillan is giving to you is valuable for that in your daily lives. Good luck, everyone, and let's stay together at this difficult time.